Good morning, everyone. Good morning to our viewers here in Malaysia, and good day to others around the world. My name is Catherine Jope, and I'm the Cultural Affairs Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. Thank you for tuning in to another U.S. Embassy KL Talks as part of our year-long series, this time focused on the very important topic of public health. We're wrapping up the year, touching on a topic that the world has struggled with for almost a year now, the COVID-19 pandemic. Unlike previous pandemics, COVID-19 has surfaced with an information disorder, or an infodemic, as misinformation about the virus spreads rapidly online. Studies show that increased susceptibility to misinformation affects people's compliance with public health guidance on the virus, people's preference to get vaccinated, as well as their willingness to recommend the vaccine to family and friends. COVID-19 misinformation undermines the collective public health response. Effective public health communication, therefore, has become all the more vital to helping governments control the spread of the virus. To address these critical challenges, we are honored to have public health misinformation expert Dr. Rupali Lemay, Associate Scientist at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, with us today, live from Washington, D.C. She will share her insights and expertise on COVID-19 misinformation and how effective public health communication can affect positive changes in health behavior concerning COVID-19. Also with us for today's discussion is our moderator, Su-Lin Bu, our very own alumnus of the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative Exchange Program, or YSEALI as it's more commonly known. She is editor-in-chief of Code Blue and has over a decade of experience in journalism, starting out her career with the Malaysian Insider and the Malay Mail before co-founding Code Blue in 2019. Code Blue is a Malaysian news site focused on promoting healthcare as a human right and provides reporting on crucial issues and policies related to Malaysian healthcare. It is a unique, necessary, and welcome addition to Malaysia's media landscape. Without further ado, I will now hand the session over to our moderator, Su-Lin, to introduce our speaker, Dr. Rupali, and to engage in an exciting and informative discussion. Over to you, Su-Lin.
Thanks, Catherine. It's a pleasure to be here. Morning to everyone. So Dr. Rupali Lemay is a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Departments of International Health, Epidemiology, and Health Behavior and Society. She also serves as the Associate Director for Behavioral Research at the Institute for Vaccine Safety. Dr. Lemay is a social and behavioral scientist and health communication scholar and studies the public health impacts of social media misinformation. She teaches classes on health behavior change and persuasive communication and has worked in more than 20 countries on topics including immunization, family planning, HIV/AIDS, maternal and child health, and alcohol. Thanks for joining us today, Dr. Rupali. How are you?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm great. Thank you.
Okay, so today's session is it's a pretty big one. We've experienced COVID since the start of the year, and now it does look like there is light at the end of the tunnel with a couple of vaccines that have passed their phase 3 clinical trials. Pfizer's vaccine has already been approved by the US FDA's advisory panel, who have recommended that the US government, that the US FDA issue an emergency use authorization for the vaccine, I think in the next couple of days, right? Yeah, so before we get into vaccines per se, so why don't we just talk about in general COVID misinformation? What kind of COVID misinformation is out there?
So there's actually been quite a bit of misinformation that has been floating around COVID. And there's two different types of, I think, information that's incorrect that we can talk about on social media. So misinformation is information that individuals see, they believe, and then they might pass on to someone else. Disinformation is information that someone takes and spreads it with the intent of misleading someone. So there is a distinction here. And I think what has happened within COVID, we're dealing with a time that is quite uncertain. It's a novel virus. So we're learning something every day from a scientific perspective. And as a result, I think people are feeling a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear around the virus because it is new. And so it really creates an environment that's ripe for misinformation, particularly misinformation related to cures is what we saw very early on in the pandemic. So thinking about and touting different types of therapeutics that had no evidence with regards to their effectiveness for treating COVID. And now we're starting to see more misinformation related to these vaccines as they're very close to coming to market.
Can you give some examples, Dr. Rupali, on like the types of misinformation about COVID, the disease, or any COVID cures?
Yeah, so one rumor that was quite prevalent for a while is individuals. There was a meme that was floating out that talked about how you could get COVID through a 5G network. And so a number of public health agencies had to put together messaging to say that viruses don't travel through 5G networks. This is a respiratory virus, is the way that you can get infected. And so that was a rumor that was quite prevalent at the beginning of the pandemic. Another rumor that we found with regards to therapeutics, different organizations and different, I would say, specific influential individuals were touting something like the use of colloidal silver as a treatment or bleach as a treatment. Both of those are not founded in any sort of scientific evidence, but there was enough discussion about both of these treatments that it really caused, the information about this to go viral. And a lot of individuals then asked questions about it because they thought maybe these are real treatments for COVID, and neither of them are treatments.
Right. In Malaysia, at the beginning of our epidemic, I think there was some rumor also about COVID turning us into zombies. So the Ministry of Health had explained that COVID is not going to turn you into a zombie. About therapeutics, though, could you talk about disinfection boxes? There are a lot of businesses in Malaysia that claim, to have this like disinfection boxes, and they spray you with some chemicals, and supposedly you'll be free of the virus. But that's not medically sound, right?
There's no scientific evidence that would back up that claim with regards to it being a credible treatment to COVID. I think part of the issue with regards to, this idea of these boxes that you're talking about is that I think people are doing all that they can to figure out how to be safe from the virus, right? This is challenging for a lot of people. People don't like feeling uncertain, and they'll do anything to reduce that uncertainty. So one way individuals reduce that uncertainty is that they look at a claim and they think, okay, well, maybe this is something that will work, and then I don't have to worry about this. And so I have a feeling that, something along these boxes that are happening, this sort of claim that's occurring, I think specifically in Malaysia, that's really one of the reasons why, is people are really looking for solutions.
Right. So far, I mean, the only safe measures we have to prevent COVID is really just the basics of like wearing face masks when you go outside, and when you meet people, washing your hands frequently. Right. Those are still the main social distancing. Those are still the mainstays, right?
That's absolutely correct. And we call them non-pharmaceutical interventions. And that's what we have right now with regards to protection. And what those do is they reduce your risk of exposure, because it is a respiratory virus. It's spread through droplets. So, the less that you are engaging with other individuals, the less you're likely to essentially be exposed to droplets in the air. Those are really ways that individuals can reduce their risk to exposure.
So let's talk further about misinformation. As we know, there is an infodemic as well. There's just so much information coming in, and with the internet, people in Malaysia and other countries, we can read materials and information from across the globe. Right? It's limitless. Right? We're not just consuming Malaysian information now about the virus. But how can people tell if what they're reading is misinformation? Because a lot of the times, when we see videos or articles, and most of the time, this content quotes so-called experts, right? So how would you know? Like I wouldn't know who is supposedly an expert in America, for example, and maybe someone in America is claiming to be a doctor and spreads misinformation about COVID. Like how would I know whether what they're saying is genuine and medically sound or not?
It's a great question, and I think it's something that can be really challenging. And I think that social media has done amazing things with regards to breaking down the digital divide and allowing people to have access for information. But just as you know, there's no fact checking, so anyone can say anything. A couple of the tips that we've really looked at and we've talked to individuals about, especially like on Facebook, for example. A lot of the sites now have something about this website, that little I, and there's that dot. Where Facebook is doing a bit of a check with regards to whether or not it could be correct or incorrect information. And it will essentially flag it and say, this might not be from a source, that this is scientifically accurate. So that's one way. The other way I would think about is I would go to trusted sources that individuals know are neutral knowledge breakers. So for example, for here, in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control is a source that individuals would go to obtain information about, anything related to therapeutics, any sort of non-pharmaceutical interventions related to COVID, and now that the vaccines are coming, vaccine information. I think the other piece is it's important for people to do their research. And when you do see something that looks like, okay, I'm not really sure if this is true or not, to see if you can really find a source for it, right, that backs up a claim. So when we were hearing claims, for example, that bleach could cure coronavirus, we were essentially asking individuals to do a little bit of digging and see where is the scientific evidence behind this. And so I think the key is really identifying sources that you trust. It's also, I think, doing a little bit of digging on your own to try to see if the information that you are reading is true or not. And then also really turning to healthcare providers and other scientists that you might know, whether that's in your community, whether those are friends that are scientists, and asking also their opinion to help you discern whether or not something is true or whether it's false.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Rupali. I guess the Facebook markers are somewhat helpful. In Malaysia, though, we use WhatsApp quite a lot. So WhatsApp doesn't have markers, and a lot of the times, like this content, like articles or videos, forwarded in WhatsApp groups, and it's a good point about doing extra research and just going to so-called trusted sources. But I think one of the problems that COVID has brought forward is that there is a sense of distrust towards the mainstream scientific community. I think it has always been there, but COVID has really brought it to the forefront because of the way the pandemic severely affected the lives of people across the globe. In Malaysia, the economic effects of moving restrictions and lockdown measures were really, really harsh. So I think because of that, people also feel a sense of maybe frustration against the political or the scientific elite, so to say. So how can we convince these people that whatever they're reading is not equivalent to so-called the mainstream side? So because I feel that they already know, so they do know what the mainstream scientific community is saying, right? But then they also read so-called alternative views, and in their minds, some people may think that these alternative views are equivalent to the mainstream view, and they don't know what to believe. So how would you persuade people like them?
Yeah, I think the first thing I want to say is that I think that individuals are really feeling they're not sure what to do, right? Most of us have never lived in a pandemic before. And so I think it is human nature for us to seek out information to try to figure out and make sense of the world. One thing that I think from a public health perspective that is very important is for us to be empathetic. People are scared, right? They have seen family members that have unfortunately been hospitalized or have unfortunately died. And I think that there is a lot of fear. And so I think, first of all, really having empathy and thinking about that everyone is struggling, whether that's economically, whether that's socially, whatever the case may be. There's, an increase in mental health issues. And so I think it's important to be empathetic, that people are not trying to, find misinformation and act upon it. One thing that I would note is that there has been, as you mentioned, a general decline in trust towards the healthcare system, and that's globally, and we've been observing that for, at least the last 20 years. So you compare this to 20 years ago, when your doctor would provide and say, I recommend you do X, Y, and Z, 99% of the time you would just do it, right? There wouldn't really be a questioning. That has shifted quite a bit, and I think part of that has to do with this idea. There's been a bit of anti-science rhetoric that has unfortunately kind of moved into our narrative. More people are looking at science as just another voice in the room and not as as the authoritative voice in the room. And so we're really struggling, I would say, from a public health perspective, is how do we regain that trust? To me, it's being transparent and it's being credible. One thing that we have learned during this pandemic is being very clear about what we know and what we don't know, and being transparent about that. One thing that we have discussed internally here as we're starting to think about the COVID-19 vaccines coming on the market, at least here in the United States, very quickly, starting this weekend, is we need to communicate very clearly about side effects that people may face. And I think that sometimes individuals, especially here in the US, there have been changes with regards to recommendations. Several months ago, it was not recommended for individuals to wear a mask. That was then changed. And that was because that's how science works, right? We learn about different progresses in science, and then we update the evidence to reflect the latest evidence. But I think individuals really saw that as, well, the CDC and the US healthcare system doesn't really know what they're talking about. And that really forced, I think, a loss of credibility. And so I think being transparent and saying, we're also learning about this every day, we're updating guidance based off of what we're learning, is going to be really crucial, and one way, I think, to build back some of that trust that we have lost.
Right. Yeah, that is an interesting point. I think the shift in medical advice, like face masks, for example, I think that was probably quite confusing to people. But yeah, science isn't static, right? And it is still a new virus, and we're still learning new things about it every day. How would you tackle misinformation, how would you tackle misinformation, especially about vaccines that are being spread by figures of authority? So they may not necessarily be what you consider to be anti-vaxxers per se, but there are figures of authority who are also spreading some form of vaccine hesitancy, and this could come from the medical community themselves, that you would think are not actually susceptible to misinformation or vaccine hesitancy, but yet when the COVID vaccines started getting approval, we see that in Malaysia too, a rise of that. So how would you tackle that? Because these are mainstream medical / legislative figures.
I think it's a really tough question. I think part of it is making sure that when we are confronted with misinformation, that we don't necessarily try to refute it. We have seen that if someone says to you that, I heard that I can use bleach, and if I use bleach that will treat COVID, I think the general tendency is for individuals to say, well, that's actually not true, right? Again, I think sort of shifting the conversation and pivoting the conversation, and instead saying, I understand there's lots of information out there. It's really hard to discern what is right or wrong. Let me tell you what I know as someone that is working in this space, right? And really focusing on this idea of, this is why it's important for you to take protective action against COVID, because one, it's severe. Two, people are susceptible to it, right? And I think here, especially in the US, we're breaking records every day, unfortunately, with regards to number of cases. People are just becoming more and more familiar and know someone that has gotten COVID and that has been in the hospital. And then I think from there, really promoting and talking to individuals about what they can do to protect themselves. So again, really focusing on social distancing, the stay-at-home orders. And I think the piece that is going to appeal to everyone, regardless of whether or not you are, political, your ideology is one way and you believe or you don't believe in science. I think one way that we can really try to unite people together is we can appeal to the fact that if we can really follow the scientific evidence and what we know now, the faster we can adhere to this, the closer we will get to going back to normal. Because I think that there is a real desire to go back to normalcy. Here in the US, a lot of us have been working from home since March. Our children have not been going to school since March. They have been home doing virtual learning. We don't see friends, we don't see family. And so I think if we can appeal to that and say, listen, if we can follow the science and if we can follow the recommendations, the quicker we will be able to resume back to normal. And that includes a vaccine. So to me, a vaccine is part of that package. That doesn't mean that we stop recommending social distancing, especially through the winter here. But the vaccine is just a part of that reducing your risk of exposure type of package. And I think it's just challenging because people are really tired. People are ready to get back to normal lives, like I said, and they're sad because they have lost their jobs and et cetera. But I think it's really important for us to continue to say, let's look at the evidence. Let's try to really talk about decisions and recommendations based off of what we are finding. And the thousands of healthcare workers that are really trying to protect you and your family.
Okay, so let's move on to vaccines now. Dr. Rupali, could you share the vaccine development process of the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, and Chinese vaccines? So maybe you could talk a bit about the regulatory, safety, and efficacy aspects of vaccine development.
Sure. So the way that the process happens, it's a rigorous process that is a step-by-step process. And so it goes through different stages and phases of clinical trials is the way that would go. So first, there has to be essentially a proof of concept before it would move into animal testing. Then the product would have to show some specific markers, if you will, before it would even go into human testing. And then when it goes into human testing, it is quite a rigorous process with regards to the number of individuals that you have to enroll, the type of safety signals that, clinical trials will look at, as well as efficacy. And there has to be not only a certain number, but there also has to be a number of cases, right? So that we can make sure and really think about the efficacy of the vaccine. And so I think the process is quite rigorous. The process is not something that happens very, very, very quickly. It costs a ton of money. And I think people sometimes don't, they look at pharmaceutical companies and they say, oh, this is just a way for pharmaceutical companies to make money. Vaccines are not really bringing in money to pharmaceutical companies. And I think the reason there's so much scrutiny with regards to the COVID-19 vaccine development process is because they have been on an expedited timeline. We've moved a little bit faster with regards to the different phases of the trials, but that's simply because we're in a pandemic. That doesn't mean, and I think a lot of people might then interpret that to mean that corners have been cut, and that is not the case. There are still independent data review boards that look at the data in terms of safety, in terms of monitoring, in terms of efficacy, and it still goes through a very rigorous process before any product would be seen not only safe, but effective to be, really moved into the human overall population and out of a clinical trial population. And so it's a quite lengthy process that's very resource intensive, I would say.
Could you elaborate a bit about how pharmaceutical companies don't actually make that much profit from vaccines? So from what I understand is the COVID vaccine development process across the board has been greatly expedited. Because we're talking about usually for vaccines, it takes about generally 10 years, right, to come up with one. I think the fastest was for mumps and Ebola, which is 4 or 5 years. So of course, people are distrustful of this really quick vaccine development process for COVID. But like you said, it is very expensive to do clinical trials. So was the COVID vaccine development process quickly expedited because in this scenario, we had a lot of governments who were already giving money to pharmaceutical companies to run their clinical trials quickly. Is that correct?
The reason that it really, I think, was expedited was because we were dealing with a pandemic. We've never seen individuals, I think, dying at this kind of a rate before from a pathogen, and specifically this virus. And so I think there was agreement that, there was a need to move this along to really reduce morbidity as well as mortality related to COVID.
And as you said, the process for testing is really quite rigorous. And if people talk about whether it's still safe for example, for Malaysians. But the fact is, a lot of vaccines that have so far produced data from their phase 3 trials. I mean, these trials are involve, I think, tens of thousands, or if you combine them all, it could reach even to 100,000 people that have already been tested in phase 3 trials for these vaccines, right?
That's exactly right. I was just going to say, sorry. No, that's exactly right. And I think sometimes some of the concerns that we have is people will say, well, I don't want to get the vaccine because it hasn't been tested in a lot of people. But actually, it's exactly what you just said. It's actually been tested in thousands of people already. And so it's important, I think, to remind people of that this isn't something that just a few, even 100 people, we're talking thousands of people have gone through these trials.
Right. And as for, say, Pfizer, Moderna's, and AstraZeneca's vaccines, I mean, they haven't, they haven't vaccinated anyone in the general population yet, well, except for UK with the emergency use approval. But, China's and Russia's vaccines, they are still undergoing phase 3 trials, but yet they have already vaccinated citizens in their general population while still undergoing phase 3 trials. Is this safe, in your opinion?
I don't know enough specifically about those two products. I would just say that, for those of us that are trying to improve trust with the public, I think as long as the pharmaceutical companies that are the Sinovac, right, and the Sputnik vaccines as long as they're being transparent about their data and what they're finding, I think is most crucial. And I don't want to comment on, I don't know how fast they have gone through the process for either of those.
Sure. Okay. So let's talk about mRNA vaccines, since Malaysia has purchased 12.8 million doses of Pfizer's vaccine, which will come into the country next year. And we've seen a lot of talk about what exactly is an mRNA vaccine, because this technology has never been used before. So perhaps you could explain how is an mRNA vaccine created? How does it work? Like, explain it to me like really layman terms, like I'm 16.
Sure. So an mRNA vaccine, essentially what it does is it takes something called a spike protein, and it replicates that spike protein and it codes that into the host cell of a body. And so I think the easiest way to explain it is that mRNA, the technology has been used, it just hasn't been used in vaccines before. So this is a new application of it. And I think people get a little bit concerned about it because it is new. However, I would argue that it's really scientific innovation that has brought us here, and has really allowed us to get to this point to be able to therefore produce a vaccine so quickly. If you compare it to other sort of vector types of vaccines where you use like a cold virus, right, like the adenovirus to create a vaccine, it takes a lot longer. So we wouldn't have a vaccine. It's just a different way to code the protein so that when it does enter a host, and it's trying to replicate, the host body recognizes it and is able to say that there's a pathogen in the body that is not supposed to be there. It's just a different way that the body would be able to respond and react to it.
Right. So the scientists are essentially creating like synthetic genetic material, right, that tells cells how to behave.
I wouldn't say it's synthetic genetic material. I would just say it's essentially creating a flag for the body so that the body is then essentially saying this is a foreign pathogen. We need to make sure and have our immune system detect this and then make sure managing it, right? Which is essentially how the immune system works.
Right. So it's not created from like dead fetuses or something.
It is not created. There's none of that sort of material in any of these vaccines. That is correct.
Right. And it's also not going to change our DNA and turn us into X-Men or something like that.
That is correct. It will not turn anyone into X-Men. No.
I have to ask this because people do have some serious concerns, including elected representatives in Malaysia. Okay, so how would you respond to people, including medical experts, who are still hesitant about using COVID vaccines? Ironically, despite the fact that getting COVID is a very serious disease, because scientists have found that COVID it's not just a flu or a bad flu. correct? Some people do suffer long-term effects from COVID, including something they call brain fog, like you lose some of your mental capacity. But yeah, despite the horrific effects of COVID itself, there does seem to be an somewhat illogical fear about the vaccine. So how would you counter that? Because these people, including medical experts, they are questioning long-term side effects. So of course we have clinical trials where people have been followed for a couple of months and there's no serious safety issues. But what about long-term side effects, like a year after taking the vaccine, or 2 years, or like now they say it's a two-dose regimen, but then people may be asking, what if you have to keep taking shots like every year?
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah, no, I think these are all good questions. I mean, one thing I would say with regards to COVID is that we do not know all of the long-term effects. You talked about sort of this issue of brain fog. There's a number of individuals that there could be cardiovascular effects that are long-term. There could be neurological effects that are long-term. And a lot of that has to do with someone's underlying conditions with regards to comorbidities that someone may or may not have. I think in that same way, right, with regards to the vaccine, I would say, and I would say this about any single vaccine, we recommend vaccines because the benefits outweigh the risks, right? Bottom line, it's important for us to make sure that we're reducing morbidity as well as mortality. COVID, because of what it has unfortunately wreaked upon, really the world, not just the United States, is a really deadly disease for a lot of people, especially for people that are higher risk, right? That have different respiratory underlying issues, have other types of comorbidities that puts them at risk for more severe cases of COVID. And I would argue that, we recommend a vaccine because, again, as I mentioned, it's gone through a rigorous safety process. It's also been determined to be efficacious, which means that we would recommend it because the benefits outweigh the risks. Now, I think there will always be people that will say, well, I'm not comfortable, I am not sure. And to me, again, it is a new vaccine. It's going to be, we're going to get these types of questions. And I instead would argue that it's important for us to be able to, again, be empathetic, build trust as to why we have trust in the vaccine development process, why we think that the product that is going to be rolled out is safe and important for you, and more importantly, that it is the best solution for you to protect you and your family. And in the end, it's an individual decision, right? Individuals will decide and say, I don't know enough about it. I don't feel comfortable taking it. And I think, again, being empathetic and saying, what other information do you need? What can help you? Here in the United States, healthcare workers will start receiving the Pfizer vaccine, I believe, tomorrow. And so it's really important for us to make sure that healthcare workers are able to talk about their experiences, right? And not only talk about their experiences, but talk about if they did experience any sort of side effect and how they would recommend the vaccine. I think that's going to be really important because healthcare workers here in the US have had such a unique perspective because they've been dealing really with COVID for months and months and months on end. As I think you all probably know, I mean, our hospitals have been to capacity numerous times throughout this pandemic. And so I think how healthcare workers communicate about it and really talk about the importance of it is also going to be really important. With that being said, there will be people that are hesitant. And I think that is something that we will have to work on with regards to vaccine acceptance. But I think for the most part, again, if we can keep the lines of communication open, if we can be transparent with the side effects, with what happened with the vaccine development process, then I think that will go a long way for convincing people.
Right. I think that's an interesting point that you brought up, Dr. Rupali, in that the benefits of a vaccine outweigh the risks. So obviously, we can't expect 100% effective medicines or vaccines. That's just not possible, right? There will be side effects. I mean, we can't expect a perfect vaccine without any side effects whatsoever. And in the UK's experience, they've already said that people with severe allergies should not be taking Pfizer's vaccine. So I think that is one thing for the public to remember, is that we should expect some flaws, correct, with the vaccine, which is acceptable, right? These things are acceptable. Maybe we could talk about along the lines too, like, for example, the current vaccines that we have, the very old vaccines that we have, like for measles or for what's the other one? Yeah, measles and other vaccines are there? Yeah. Anyway, so maybe you could talk about those other general vaccines. How, typically how effective are they?
It's a great question. So it really depends on the vaccine, right? So if we're thinking about a common vaccine that we have, which is measles, mumps, and rubella, if you finish the course of the vaccines, it's highly effective, like more than 90% effective in terms of, if you're exposed in terms of prevention of acquiring it. I think that in terms of the side effects, that is something that we do talk about. Some of the common side effects from some of the vaccines that are recommended currently will be swelling at the injection site, some redness, perhaps a low-grade fever, perhaps just not feeling well for a couple of days. And I think for the COVID-19 vaccines, there's going to be, I think, some similar side effects, most likely in the clinical trial data. For the Pfizer candidate, I believe there were people did say that they felt unwell for a couple of days. And I think it's important to communicate that so people aren't scared about it, that this is a normal reaction. People might experience this. And really, if you have questions, who to talk to, right? If you do have questions after getting a vaccine, making sure that we are putting that person in touch with someone that they do feel comfortable reaching out to and talking to if they're concerned about a side effect. But I think, again, it comes down to transparency. One way that we talk about vaccines is as if you think about a child and you think about a car seat. You hope you never have to test that car seat in a crash, but you're really happy that it's there. And I think about vaccines in the exact same way. It's one way to provide your body with some armor that if you do end up being exposed to the virus, you'll be able to fend off and, hopefully not have any severe types of manifestations of the disease that the virus is helping you protect.
Right, or like the polio vaccine, right? I mean, polio is supposed to have been eradicated, unfortunately, for decades. Unfortunately, we saw it come back, both in the US and in Malaysia. So, yeah, and vaccines were obviously highly effective in those circumstances, right? And it was because of vaccine hesitancy that led to the reemergence of what could have been vaccine preventable diseases. What would you say to people who say that these new COVID vaccines are not a cure? Supposedly because they're saying that the studies have not yet shown how we can prevent infection. Like it can only prevent symptoms, you from getting the disease with symptoms. So these people are asking, but it doesn't prevent infection per se. So you could still kind of infect somebody else, even though you got the vaccine. So how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, again, I would argue that vaccines are just another tool in sort of our public health precautions that we are trying to take. Is that it is essentially, if you are exposed, if you do end up getting exposed to the virus, the chances are it reduces your risk of contracting it, and it really contracting, I think, and having a more severe case of it is what I would say. So, I think to me, another way to think about this is that if we do want to stop the pandemic and we want to get out of the pandemic, it's important for us to reach herd immunity. And there's really two kind of primary ways to do that, is that you either get exposed, meaning you get COVID, or you get the vaccine. And so you couple those two things together, and that really helps you reach herd immunity. The whole point of a virus, the whole reason it is around is because it wants to replicate. If it can't find a susceptible host, it won't be able to replicate and it will die out in the population. And that's really what vaccines help us do. It helps us reach herd immunity. So like in the case of polio, if a polio pathogen is circulating in a particular community and it's trying to find a host and there's no host that's susceptible because either A, someone has been exposed, or B, someone has the vaccine, then the host, then the virus itself will die out. And we're trying to do the exact same thing. And I think that's the way that I would talk about it, with people that say, well, it's not a cure. No, it reduces your risk. It's just like any other vaccine. It's getting your body prepared for something in case you do end up being exposed to it, so it can fight it, and therefore you won't have such a severe case, especially, and also hopefully prevent death for those individuals that are, have really struggled with severe cases of COVID.
Right. So the question really is, do you want to get so-called natural immunity by getting COVID first, or do you want to get immunity from a vaccine, right? That is a choice, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for us, I think here in the US, I think we've increased, and there's studies that have looked at specific cities where specific cities already have high rates of immunity because people have been exposed to the virus. But that's also uneven across sort of cities and geographical areas. And so the easiest way for us to move towards herd immunity would be a wide acceptance of COVID-19 vaccines.
What about boosting so-called natural immunity against COVID? Not by getting COVID, but by living healthily or consuming herbal products. Would that help boost natural immunity towards COVID?
So there's no, to my knowledge, there's not scientific evidence that says, really focusing on herbal therapeutics or other types of preventive types of measures would prevent you from getting the virus. There's been no known, I would say, combination of therapies that could prevent you. And so for right now, the best things that we have with regards to protecting yourself and your family is really continuing to doing social distancing, mask wearing, stay at home. And then of course now vaccine will be another nice public health preventative solution for us.
I think we should talk about the benefits of the vaccine a little bit more when it comes to returning to normal life. I mean, we know that a vaccine is not the silver bullet to the pandemic. I mean, for Malaysia itself, we have secured supply for 30% of our population for next year. But that's just 30%, right? It's nowhere near population herd immunity that we would need for everyone to be immune to COVID. So while we have a third or less than a third of the population that will get vaccinated, what could life look like for people who have been vaccinated? Like, does it mean, once I get my shots, can I go out and hug someone? Can I go around without a mask? What does it look like?
It's a great question. And I think the reason that this is going to be a little bit challenging in terms of answering is that I think part of it is because there's going to be limited supply, as you just mentioned, right? So if Malaysia is going to have, about 30% of the population, at least so far, vaccines have been procured for 30% of the population. I still think, we'll still we'll encourage people. I would say the public health recommendations should still stay in place with regards to what we're doing right now. However, as there become more doses and it is delivered and more people accept the vaccine, then I think we'll start being able to resume somewhat of a normal lifestyle again, right? So I think at the beginning, when the vaccine is first being rolled out to specific subpopulations, I don't think it's one of those things where you can say, great, we don't have to wear a mask, I don't have to do any of these things. I think that as more and more people get the vaccine and more individuals in the community increase herd immunity in these communities, then we'll start to be able to revert a little bit more back to, sort of normal life, and putting that in quotes. And so I think it's going to also depend very much on whether or not people accept the vaccine, and time will really tell. So, the quicker I think there's acceptance of the vaccine and we have higher rates of individuals that are taking the vaccine, the easier it will be to get back to normal. However, if that takes a long time and, people are saying, I'd like to wait a year or maybe even a little bit longer, then it will take just a longer time for us to get there.
Right. So people who got the vaccine can be able to hug someone, but those who didn't get a vaccine should just stay home.
I think that, I think I would still say continue to be safe.
Right? We can do it. Yeah. But if you don't get a vaccine, then sure, just stay home, don't go out.
Yeah, I think the problem is, we've seen that here, is that we have people, especially here in the States, that I think that we have heard, like, if you don't want to wear a mask, that's fine, then stay home. But that's not really what we're seeing, right? We're still seeing people out that don't want to wear a mask and want to really not adhere to that type of a recommendation. And so I think if that were the case, if we said, if you don't want a vaccine, just stay home, great. That's just not, that's just not how things so far have been going.
Okay, we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. Ooh, So here's one, Dr. Rupali. So how would you respond to concerns that vaccines developed in the West will not be able to accommodate warmer climate countries like Malaysia, that these vaccines would have degraded efficacy in tropical countries?
It's a really good question. And I think it depends on the product and sort of the cold chain requirements of the product, right? We do know that, in terms of the mRNA vaccines, that they do require a much colder in terms of temperature for storage, which can be really challenging. In a number of the countries that I work in that are especially in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, one thing that is always in consideration is the refrigeration challenges and issues. So once a vaccine even gets to a specific country that might be in a more tropical climate, how do we ensure that it is stable at the temperature that we need it to be stable to remain efficacious? And then as it goes out, especially as it's going out to more sort of rural or geographically spread locations, how do we make sure that, that the actual individuals, whether those are healthcare workers or those are immunizers, are going out and are keeping it safe? And so I think a lot of it will depend just on the product and sort of the requirements of the product with regards to refrigeration and cold chain.
Even the US also has significant challenges in deploying ultra cold vaccines, right?
Yes, so the mRNA vaccines are very unique in that way that the refrigeration that they require is quite cold, and not anything really that any other vaccine currently requires. And so that will also be a challenge of making sure that there are facilities that can store these and can keep them at the optimal temperature to ensure that they are still efficacious.
Okay, another question from the audience. Do you have any tips to share on how governments can employ an effective public health communication strategy?
Yeah, I think the couple of tips that I would say is be transparent. Again, I think going back to this idea of saying, this is what we know, this is what we don't know. With regards to the vaccines, I think being very clear and upfront about the potential side effects will be very crucial. The other piece I would say is making sure that there are individuals sort of ready for questions, that are empathetic and are able to talk to individuals that might have questions and might have concerns about a vaccine so that they're ready for them. And then the other piece would be is really trying to identify and think about trusted opinion leaders. And these can be localized in different communities that people go to for information in general, that you can really work with and leverage to help them talk about the vaccine and why it's important for them to get the vaccine, not only for themselves, but how to protect their families and their communities. And so I think, really thinking about trust, thinking about empathy, having a resource for people to go to, and then really relying on trusted localized voices to spread the message are all good tips.
Okay. Also, maybe I know it may not be in your specific area of expertise, but there has been a lot of discussions that vaccines should be available for the public good. But what does that mean? Like, at what cost? For example, like the AstraZeneca vaccine. Do you think COVAX would actually work? Will rich countries end up snatching up all the vaccine supply and leave poorer countries in the lurch?
It's a great question. And I think for me, I think health is a human right. I think that there are major issues of equity, happening on our planet, unfortunately, and I think that, thinking about, I feel like anything that is, able to protect a life, that should be free, that should be accessible to anyone that needs it, dependent, regardless of where someone lives and regardless of their nationality and their race. I think that the challenge is, as you just mentioned, the way that our systems are set up, that there is some inequity, I think, structurally within the ways that we deliver health. With that being said, though, I think that it is really imperative and very important for those countries that are richer and that are able to provide support to countries that might not be as well off, as to how to ensure that there is equitable access for all. I work at a center at Hopkins called the International Vaccine Access Center, and that is directly in our mission. How do we make sure that we ensure equitable access and allocation to vaccines? And so I think it will be interesting to see moving forward, particularly as the vaccine candidates roll out. And there's a number of candidates that are still in the clinical trial process, right? So I'm also hopeful that moving forward in the next few months, there'll be more candidates, and therefore there will be more ability, I would say, or potential for countries to be able to get a candidate, because there will be more than just one or two that will really help with that equity piece.
Right, and making it accessible to as many people or countries as possible, regardless of their socioeconomic status, doesn't necessarily mean providing the vaccine for free to everyone, right? Because if certain countries are able to pay for it for a certain price, then that's fine, right? Whereas the poor countries obviously may only afford a cheaper price, and then you have different prices for them, right? It doesn't mean that you have to have absolutely free vaccines for the entire globe, correct?
Exactly. I mean, and just as you mentioned, I mean, there are countries that can pay for some of them and then subsidize the cost, right? For other countries that don't necessarily have the resources. And it is important, I think, for countries that are more well off to really, to be able to illustrate and showcase that this is really a global public health good. Because I do think that it's, like I said, health is a human right. And so it's important for those that can give more to give more.
Okay, let's talk about the rolling out of the vaccine. Should the government adopt policy measures in rolling out the vaccine to ensure that vulnerable groups, including migrant workers and people in detention centers, are prioritized? So, what kind of priority targets should governments look at?
It's a great question. And I think here in the United States, the way that it has been discussed is that it was a rather lengthy and long consultative process to determine tiers with regards to the priorities that we have, the prioritization of groups, I would say, that we have here in the United States. And so, for example, healthcare workers, individuals that are living in long-term care facilities, so nursing homes and assisted homes, are top of the list here. And I think when you're thinking about this in terms of other countries, I think it's the same sort of strategy that you use is who is more at risk, right? Is it individuals that are migrant workers that are essentially exposed to the virus multiple times, are essentially not able to stay home, right? So I think it's the same way. I think it's thinking about all these risks, coming up with some sort of a way to score and weight these different types of risks, and then coming up with some sort of a system with regards to prioritization. Because I do think it's important for those that are being exposed to it every day and don't have a choice, that they are able to get it earlier. I feel very lucky. Me and my husband both have been working from home since March. We're not exposed on a day-to-day basis. And so I think that we should wait. I think people like healthcare workers, teachers, individuals that are really doing the job and keeping economies going, they should actually have prioritization of the vaccine.
Right. So it's mainly about who is more at risk, who is at greater risk should get it first. So
Yep.
frontline healthcare workers or law enforcement. Well, in our case, because the law enforcers do make sure that they go around checking premises to see if people are wearing masks or socially distancing, and they keep arresting. They keep fining people for not wearing masks, which is like $300, which is crazy. Well, but our mask, I feel that Malaysia's mask compliance rate is extremely high, despite the so-called repeated arrests every day. In terms of who is most vulnerable here in Malaysia, so besides the frontline workers, we have seen and we are continuing to see repeated outbreaks in the prison populations and in migrant workers here, who live in very congested workers' dormitories or even outside in the community too. But there may be some resistance towards giving prisoners and migrant workers the vaccine first. Like, how would you counter that, right? Because the citizens would feel like they should get it first.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, you have to take sort of morality out of the situation, right? I think we have to look at risk and say, just as you're saying, they're living in populations that are overcrowded, that essentially are really creating an environment for for the virus to be able to spread, to be able to find a susceptible host and to continue to live, right? To continue to propagate. And so I think it's very important for individuals to understand and take sort of the morality out of it, that just because they're prisoners doesn't mean that they're not human. To me, it's thinking about risk and really trying to prioritize that risk and saying that these are individuals that are higher risk, and so they should be prioritized. And I think there's been some debate here as well with regards to prisoners in terms of when they should be getting the vaccine. But again, I think it has to come down to science, and we have to look at where are people more at risk and have more, I think, opportunities to be exposed, and how do we protect those populations before we protect populations that aren't necessarily at that same level of risk exposure.
Right. And also, I suppose the benefit from focusing those who are most at risk, even if they are non-nationals, is that we would see almost immediate or short-term results by vaccinating these populations, because it would prevent repeated outbreaks, right, among these people.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So it's not only protecting them, but subsequently, indirectly would protect other segments of the population.
Okay, and let's see. Are there maybe you could talk a bit about misinformation again. So you're saying that you would recommend that the government have like specific kind of resources, right, for people to seek information if they need to. Besides that, do you think that governments as a whole should also use public figures, popular public figures, to promote vaccines or to reassure people that they're safe? Because I think now, with the distrust against the scientific community, people may be more inclined to, or more persuaded to take a vaccine if they see their favorite celebrity taking it. I think the Elvis Presley polio campaign really helped, right?
Yeah, no, and I think that, as I had mentioned earlier, I think if individuals and if communities and public health agencies can identify local leaders, right, that people are comfortable with and that they trust, I think it's going to be really important. I think here in the United States, we've definitely seen that there's been more of a grassroots approach of identifying local community opinion leaders, having them talk about the recommendations like social distancing, mask wearing, etc. And I don't think that will change once the vaccines are rolling out and that they're available to the general public. I think, again, people are looking to them for information and recommendations. And so I think utilizing that same strategy will be really important.
Oh, just one more question from the audience. Dr. Rupali, any comments on remdesivir and its efficacy and costs?
I am not an immunologist, and so I don't want to comment too much about this. I would say that, I don't know what the cost is either, so sorry. But so I would definitely refer to this person to an immunologist, I think, to get more information about its efficacy.
Okay, I think that pretty much wraps it up. I think before we go, any final guidance for both governments and individuals on how to promote, on how to fight misinformation about COVID and vaccines in general?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, everyone plays a part here to be vigilant. When you're talking to a relative and a relative says, well, I heard about this and, so-and-so, I think it's really important for everyone to be able to say, okay, well, I'm not sure if that was really based in science. Let's try to find sources that I think can help you. I think everyone is playing a part, from the actual social media platforms and companies themselves to the government, to individuals that might be more savvy with regards to discerning what is misinformation or disinformation, particularly among sort of older segments of the population that might be more susceptible, I would say, to this type of information. I think the other key is really identifying what is a trusted source that is based in science that you can check, right? That you can go back and look at the evidence and say that the recommendations and the information that they are providing to us is based in evidence is going to be really crucial and really important. And so I think really relying on public health officials, not only at sort of the national level, but to me more at sort of these local, provincial, state levels, is going to be really important to consider how do we essentially mitigate, I think, the threat of misinformation, because it has been a major challenge. As I think you all mentioned earlier on, it's really been an infodemic. And so it's important for us to continue to fight against this, particularly as the vaccines are starting to roll out. And we know there's going to be more misinformation coming.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Rupali. So that's about it for our session. It was really good talking to you and hearing all the tips about misinformation. Yeah, I think we have learned quite a lot about it. And generally, I think people should remember that the benefits from a vaccine outweigh the risks, right? And in terms of countering misinformation, so the trick is to listen to people and to address their fears rather than dismissing their fears outright or to label them anti-vaxxers, right?
That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
All right, so over to you, Catherine.
Thank you so much, Sulin. I'd like to offer a huge thank you to both you, Sulin Bu, and Dr. Rupali Lamay for this really enlightening and informative discussion on COVID-19 misinformation. The discussion on ways we can combat this misinformation collectively to help to control the virus, I think was a very timely and important discussion. I personally learned a lot, and I think that these topics of empathy for others and really helping to verify different sources of information, we at the U.S. Embassy remain committed to that. And again, we're delighted to provide this forum today for folks to exchange on this important topic. So on behalf of the U.S. Embassy here in Kuala Lumpur, I'd like to thank all of our viewers this morning for tuning in, and I hope you found this session informative and beneficial. We will be posting the entire discussion on our Facebook page for later viewing. We invite you to come and engage with us on our social media platforms. Let us know what topics are of interest to you, and we look forward to the continuing discussion. With that, stay safe, take care, best wishes for the remainder of 2020, and a very healthy and happy new year. Terima kasih.